everyone, and welcome back to the Vicki McKenna Show. We're talking a lot about these congressional maps, and it's important to explain I guess this is lawfare. The challenge to these maps would be lawfare because they have been challenged, they have been approved, and it goes like this. But in order to kind of walk you back through the history of why it's important that what Susan Crawford has essentially promised to do to her donors to blow up these maps if she's elected is in the face of logic, the law, and history. And Rick Essenberg knows more about maps than most people in the country from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. As I understand, I think Will was involved in some of the cases in the latest round of congressional map drawing.
Well, yes, both rounds. So when, the maps have to be redrawn after the census because all legislative districts, both in the state level and in Congress, have to be equal in size, except, of course, for the United States Senate, which senators represent states. So they have to be withdrawn. And after the 2020 census, it was quite clear that the governor and the legislature would never be able to agree on how to withdraw them. And so it was going to have to be done by the courts. We brought a case on behalf of a group of voters in the Wisconsin Supreme Court as an original action. And we said, look, this is something that should be done by state courts because under the United States Constitution and the state constitution, it's a state function. That case was fully litigated. I actually wound up going all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And a set of maps were drawn and used in 2022. The balance of power on the court shifted. The court then did something extraordinary, something really it's never done before. It decided to reopen the question of maps when a litigant asked it to do so. And, I won't get into the details of it, but in a really extraordinary series of moves that were very, very unusual with respect to our normal respect for the finality of judgment, with respect to due process, with respect to honoring the type of legislature that our Constitution establishes, that is one that is made up of contiguous and compact geographic districts represented by a single person, and as such will not necessarily match the overall state vote for statewide partisan candidates. I could go on and on about how unusual this was, but they redrew the maps. But these were only the state legislative maps. Congressional maps were not at issue in that case. And so the question now is, if Judge Crawford is elected and the legal left maintains its majority on the state Supreme Court, will they go after the congressional maps? And there are a lot of signals being given that, yes, they will. And I could give you a lot of reasons, Vicki, why they shouldn't do that, why it would be improper to do that. But even what happened before, when we thought that we had won a case, and then it turns out 2 years later our victory was taken away from us, I couldn't possibly tell you in good faith that it can't happen, won't happen, or even that it's unlikely to happen. Yeah,
of course, I think it will. Hakeem Jeffries thinks it will. J.B. Pritzker and Reid Hoffman and George Soros all think it will, or they would not be pouring so many resources into this race to get Susan Crawford elected. So the maps that were adopted that are being accused of being gerrymandered were the maps that Tony Evers wanted to see in place in Wisconsin. So apparently that's what Tony Evers does, is gerrymander maps. But let's talk about the issue of gerrymandering. How on earth could you ever make a claim that these maps are gerrymandered unless you change the definition of gerrymandered to mean not enough Democrats have won elections?
Well, of course, that's what they did in the earlier case, Vicki. An argument had been made for many, many years, and in fact, Dewey at Will made it on a number of occasions. It's very, very difficult to identify a gerrymander because, how do you define what the natural amount of Democrats and Republicans would be? And the one response that isn't crazy to that argument is, well, here's what we could do. We could take a computer and we could run 20,000 map simulations, and we could see how those maps are projected to perform, and the one that's kind of in the middle with the median amount of Republicans and Democrats, that's the one that's not gerrymandered. And so we took them at their word when this case was refiled, and it became clear that the state Supreme Court was going to redraw the maps. And we drew pristine maps. In fact, we asked our people to draw those maps, even taking into account the partisan tilt of the map, and only at the end would we turn that on and see, how many Republicans and how many Democrats would be elected. And you would think that the other side would be happy that we had finally adopted their position, maybe because we felt we had no choice, but we adopted it. And but no, this was no longer the test. The test now was that you have to elect a number of Republican and Democratic legislators, which is roughly proportional to the vote received by Democratic and Republican statewide candidates. And that, of course, is preposterous.
It's nuts.
This is the first thing you teach in election law, that there's no reason that a legislature elected from single-member geographic districts would turn out that way. It depends on where people live.
It absolutely does, because the people who live in Madison have different priorities than the people who live in La Crosse, have the different priorities than the people who live in Prairie du Chien. They're not even, in fact, the priorities don't even tend not to cross much at all, since Madison seems to think, or Milwaukee seems to think, that politics, that national ideological politics should rule the day, when in a place like Prairie du Chien, they would probably think, making sure we've got roads, adequate police officers, et cetera. Those practical things tend to take precedent. But those are our state maps. And that was the logic this court already adopted. And they want to apply that same logic to the congressional maps and take out 2 seats. One of them, Derek Van Orden, the other one, Brian Stile. And it would not take a whole lot of heavy lifting to just move 2 lines. I think you'd have to move 2 lines in order to take out Derek Van Orden and give people in that district Mark Pocan, or take out people in Brian Stiles' district and give those people Gwen Moore. They want to replace Derek Van Orden with Mark Pocan in one of the most rural parts of Wisconsin, and they want to replace Brian Stile with Gwen Moore in one of the most suburban parts of Wisconsin, because it takes away the Republican majority. And that's the goal here. That's what our court has become, Rick. I don't know how you as a lawyer could even present a case to this court and not already know what the outcome would be.
Well, I'm not going to comment on that, Vicki. But yeah, I mean, this was a very, very results-oriented undertaking. Those maps were going to go, and they were going to be redrawn in a way which benefits Democrats. Now, at the end of the day, Speaker Voss settled with them because he decided to get the best deal he thought he could get. I don't know whether that was the right decision or not, but I can see why he did it. But they made it quite clear that this was the direction in which this was going to go, including by hiring their own experts who were just awful, if not an unfair term to apply to those guys. And so, could it happen again? Will it happen again? I think that that's one of the things that's on stake on Tuesday. And I know that, the Supreme Court is something that, seems, very technical, very dry, not very interesting, but it has a very, very real impact on how we're going to live our lives and what we're going to do. This is an example. It's a big example, but it's not the only example. And so if you have, listeners out there who think, well, I voted in the presidential race, and I voted for Donald Trump, and I just don't know about this court stuff. I think, Vicki, that in this case, the Supreme Court race will make a huge difference. This business about redistricting is one of them, but there are many, many others that I could list. This is just as important as the presidential election, and your listeners, they need to get out and they need to vote in this race because it is critical for the future of the state of Wisconsin.
I think that's not – I don't think that's hyperbole. The majority in the U.S. House of Representatives will be determined by who wins this Supreme Court race because of the maps issue we were just talking about. Whether or not the legislature will be able to legislate is going to be determined by the Supreme Court because there are cases on point to that question. Whether, reforms like school choice or Act 10, et cetera, survive is all going to be answered by who wins this Supreme Court election. But importantly, the entire country and the MAGA agenda, Trump's agenda, is hinging on who wins this race. I don't think that's an overstatement.
Yeah, I mean, things like, racialized curricula in public school, things like transgender ideology in public school. I mean, these things are all going to be affected by what happens. And so there is no excuse, absolutely none, to sit this one out. And I understand that a court race can seem technical and sometimes it seems remote from our day-to-day lives, but it really isn't. This court makes huge difference decisions, and the degree of latitude that I think the majority believes that it has to impose its preferences on the state of Wisconsin is really extraordinary. And I think that my personal opinion, certainly, I mean, Will doesn't have an opinion on the race because he can't have one, but I certainly think that I would recommend that your voters get out there and vote for Judge Schimmel.
Thanks so much, Rick, for coming on the program today. I always appreciate it. Attorney Rick Essenberg, also with the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Have a great one, Rick. Thank you very much.